On July 12, 2025, Blackfoot elder Nina 2 Shields was found wandering along Route 49 near East Glacier Park, Montana. She was severely dehydrated, suffering from exposure, and had lost 23 pounds over the 9 days she'd been missing. The search party that had been looking for her and 3 companions had covered over 80 square miles of wilderness without finding a single trace. The 3 others, wildlife biologist Martin Reeves, Blackfoot tribal police officer Daniel Running Elk, and Nina's nephew Samuel 2 Shields, were never recovered. Montana state authorities officially classified their disappearances as probable deaths due to exposure and wildlife predation, despite the absence of any remains. What follows is Nina's account, recorded at Blackfoot Community Hospital 3 days after her rescue, and later transcribed from audio with her permission. My name is Nina 2 Shields. I am 63 years old. I have served as a medicine woman for the Blackfeather Nation for nearly 40 years, following the path my grandmother walked before me. I was born on the reservation and have spent my life studying our traditional healing practices and spiritual traditions. Before this happened, I divided my time between my clinical work at the Tribal Health Center and my traditional practice from my home in Bab. I have a doctorate in ethnobotany from the University of Montana, and I have documented over 300 medicinal plants used by our people since time immemorial. I am not someone who sees visions in shadows or hears voices in the wind. I deal in measurable outcomes, pulse rates, inflammation reduction, pain management through properly prepared herbs and traditional treatments. What I encountered in the Cutbank Valley defies everything I understand about our world. Martin was 42, a wildlife biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He stood about 6 feet tall with the lean build of someone who spends most of their life outdoors. His brown hair was going gray at the temples, and he had deep smile lines around his eyes despite his serious demeanor. He'd been stationed in East Glacier for 7 years, studying grizzly migration patterns and working on human-wildlife conflict reduction. I had known him professionally for about 5 years. He often consulted me about Blackfoot historical accounts of animal behavior and traditional ecological knowledge. Martin carried a Glock 20 in 10mm standard issue for biologists working in grizzly country and wore it in a chest holster where he could reach it quickly. He was methodical, careful, and knew the backcountry of the park better than anyone except maybe Daniel. Daniel Running Elk was 38 and had served on the tribal police force for 15 years. He stood just under 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the solid build of someone who stays fit because their life might depend on it. His face was weathered from years spent outdoors, with small scars above his right eye from a bar fight in his early 20s that he never talked about. Daniel carried his service weapon, a Sig Sauer P320 plus a backup Smith & Wesson J-frame revolver, in an ankle holster. He also brought his personal Remington 870 tactical shotgun loaded with slugs, primarily as bear protection. Daniel had done 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Marines before returning to the reservation, and he moved through the wilderness with the hypervigilance of someone who had been in combat zones. He never stepped anywhere without scanning, never entered a space without checking sightlines, never relaxed completely. Daniel was my second cousin once removed, and I had known him since he was a child. Samuel was my sister's boy, 24 years old, 6'2", with the ranginess of youth still on him. He had graduated from the University of Montana 2 years earlier with a degree in environmental science and was working for the Tribal Natural Resources Department. He wore his hair in 2 long braids and had a tattoo of a golden eagle in flight across his upper back. Samuel was quiet, thoughtful, with a deep reverence for our traditions despite his modern education. He was the one who first heard the stories from the elders in the northern part of the reservation. Stories about people going missing in Cutbank Valley, about strange lights and sounds that made the dogs howl and the horses panic. Samuel carried a Winchester .30-30 lever action that had belonged to his father. He wasn't as experienced with firearms as Martin or Daniel, but he'd grown up hunting and knew how to handle himself in the backcountry. It began with Jenny Little Plume's disappearance on June 30th. Jenny was 78 and lived alone in a small cabin near the northern boundary of the reservation, about 17 miles from the nearest neighbor. When her son came to check on her after 3 days of unanswered calls, he found the cabin empty. The door was unlocked. A pot of stew sat half-eaten on the table. Her truck was still parked outside, and her walking cane still stood in its usual place by the door. Jenny had severe arthritis and never went anywhere without that cane. The tribal police searched the area for 2 days and found nothing. Not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not a sign of struggle. 3 days after Jenny disappeared, Thomas Blackweasel went missing from his fishing spot on Cutbank Creek. Thomas was 82, a respected elder who had fought in Vietnam and returned to become one of our most knowledgeable tradition keepers. His truck was found parked at his usual access point to the creek. His fishing gear was set up on the bank. Rod holder driven into the ground, tackle box open, half a sandwich wrapped in wax paper sitting on a flat rock. The creek at that point was shallow, no more than 2 feet deep. There was no way he could have drowned, and no signs of animal predation or human violence. What connected these disappearances, beyond their proximity, was what the locals reported the nights before each person vanished. The night before Jenny disappeared, her nearest neighbor, still miles away, reported seeing unusual lights in the sky above Cutbank Valley. Not like aircraft lights, she said, more like the northern lights, but focused in a tight column that reached from the clouds down to the earth. The night before Thomas disappeared, 3 separate households reported a sound like deep resonant humming that made the windows vibrate and the livestock panic. In each case, the phenomena lasted for approximately 20 minutes and then stopped abruptly. As a tribal elder and medicine woman, I felt responsible for investigating. These were our people vanishing from our land, and I understood the spiritual significance of the valley better than most outsiders. Cutbank Creek follows a valley that our people have long considered a boundary between worlds. Our oldest stories talk about the sky people who would come down through thin places to hunt, not for animals, but for us. My grandmother used to warn me never to sleep in certain parts of that valley, especially not on nights when the stars were particularly bright. As a child, I accepted these warnings without question. As I grew older and more educated, I categorized them as cultural metaphors, beautiful expressions of our relationship with the land, but not literal truth. I was wrong. July 3rd, 12:17 p.m., Cutbank Valley northern section, notable absence of typical biophony, no avian vocalizations, no insect activity audible, ambient temperature, 74 degrees Fahrenheit, barometric pressure. He continued dictating environmental readings while scanning the valley walls with binoculars. Samuel moved closer to me. "Aunt Nina," he said in a low voice, "remember what Old Man Creates Fire told us about the silent places?" I nodded. Joseph Creates Fire was 97, one of our oldest living elders. He had told us that the sky people create silence before they hunt. They absorb all sound, he said, like a sponge soaking up water. When you can no longer hear the world around you, they are near. I had interpreted this as poetic language describing heightened awareness during dangerous situations. Now I wasn't so sure. We continued north after lunch. The silence persisted, becoming heavier, more oppressive. Even our footsteps seemed muffled, as if we were walking on foam instead of rocky soil. At 2:45 p.m., we found Jenny Little Plume's pendant, a small piece of turquoise wrapped in silver wire that her son had confirmed she always wore. It was lying on a flat rock beside the creek, undamaged, the silver chain coiled neatly beneath it, as if it had been deliberately placed there. There were no footprints, no disturbed vegetation, no signs that anyone had stood in that spot. Daniel photographed the pendant in place before carefully bagging it as evidence. Martin recorded the GPS coordinates and made detailed notes about the surrounding area. Samuel stood a few yards away, staring up at the valley walls with a troubled expression. I joined him, following his gaze. "What do you see?" I asked. "I'm not sure," he said. For a second, I thought I saw something moving up there, not an animal. More like the air was bending, like heat waves, but more structured. I squinted up at the cliff face, but saw nothing unusual. The rock was bare, gray-brown limestone with patches of lichen and sparse vegetation clinging to cracks. Nothing moved except a few small clouds passing overhead. We found Thomas Blackweasel's sacred pipe at 4:30 p.m., about 3 miles north of where we'd found Jenny's pendant. The pipe was his most prized possession, a 100-year-old Catlinite pipe with an eagle bone stem that had belonged to his grandfather. It was lying in the center of a perfect circle of flattened grass, approximately 12 feet in diameter. The grass wasn't broken or crushed. It was pressed down in a smooth, even pattern, as if something perfectly round and heavy had rested there. There were no tracks leading to or from the circle. Thomas's pipe lay exactly in the center, the stem and bowl aligned precisely north-south. Daniel approached the circle cautiously, his hand on his sidearm. Martin was recording everything with his camera. Samuel hung back, his face pale, his eyes scanning the valley rim continuously. I felt a deep unease settling into my bones. Not fear, exactly, but a growing certainty that we were in the presence of something beyond our understanding. The air temperature within the circle was noticeably cooler, at least 15 degrees colder than the surrounding area. Martin verified this with his thermometer, looking increasingly disturbed as he took multiple readings. When Daniel stepped into the circle to retrieve the pipe, he gasped and jumped back out immediately. "Something's wrong in there," he said, his voice tight. "The air feels thick, heavy, and there's a vibration coming up through the ground." I could feel it too, a subtle trembling in the earth beneath our feet, not like an earthquake or rockfall, but a constant, rhythmic pulsing like the heartbeat of something enormous. Martin placed his palm flat on the ground outside the circle, then carefully reached across the boundary to touch the ground inside. "There's a significant difference in vibration frequency," he said, his scientific detachment slipping. "I've never encountered anything like this." Samuel was backing away, the Winchester now in his hands, though I hadn't seen him draw it. "Aunt Nina," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "we need to leave. Now." Before I could respond, the silence deepened. It wasn't just an absence of sound anymore. It was as if sound itself was being actively cancelled, pushed out of the air around us. My ears popped painfully, and I felt a pressure building in my sinuses and behind my eyes. Martin was saying something, his mouth moving, but no sound reached me. Daniel had drawn his sidearm and was scanning the valley in a controlled sweep, his body language shifting to combat readiness. Samuel had moved to my side, one hand gripping my arm, the other still holding his rifle. Then the humming began. It started as a single pure tone, so low that I felt it in my chest cavity more than heard it. The pitch rose gradually, gaining harmonics until it seemed to fill the entire valley with overlapping layers of sound. The vibration passed through my body like electricity, making my teeth ache and my vision blur. I saw Martin drop to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears. Daniel remained standing but was visibly struggling, his face contorted in pain. The light changed. The afternoon sun dimmed as if passing behind a cloud, but when I looked up, the sky was clear. The quality of the light shifted from golden yellow to a pale bluish white that cast no shadows. Everything in the valley, the trees, the creek, the rocks, our own bodies, seemed suddenly flat and two-dimensional, like cutouts against a painted backdrop. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a distortion in the air above the valley rim, like heat waves or a mirage. Then it moved, and I understood that I was seeing something physical, something real, but so far outside my frame of reference that my mind struggled to process it. It descended from above, not flying but unfolding into our space. It was tall, at least 30 feet from what appeared to be its base to its upper extremity. The body was cylindrical, tapering at both ends, with a pearlescent surface that reflected light in ways that made its exact boundaries difficult to determine. What I initially took for limbs were actually projections that extended and retracted from the main body, not arms and legs as we understand them, but flexible appendages that changed length and configuration as I watched. The upper portion contained what might have been sensory organs, 5 circular structures arranged in a pentagon, each one about the size of a dinner plate, that pulsed with internal light. They weren't eyes as we understand them, but they were clearly meant for observation. The entire entity vibrated at a frequency that synchronized with the humming sound filling the valley. It wasn't making the sound, it was the sound somehow translated into physical form. Daniel fired. The report of his handgun was strangely muted, barely audible above the humming. I saw the flash, saw the entity's surface ripple where the bullet should have impacted, but there was no other effect. He fired again, emptying his magazine in a rapid series of shots. The entity didn't react. It continued its slow descent into the valley, the projections now extending toward the ground where we stood. Martin had recovered enough to pull Samuel and me backward, away from the circle where Thomas's pipe still lay. Daniel was reloading, his movements automatic, his face set in grim determination. The entity reached the valley floor about 50 yards from our position. The ground beneath it darkened, not as if in shadow, but as if the earth itself was being leached of color and substance. One of the appendages extended toward us with impossible speed, covering the distance between the main body and our group in less than a second. It was upon us before any of us could react. The tip split into smaller tendrils that moved with precision and purpose. I felt a sharp, cold pressure at the base of my skull, then numbness spreading down my spine. My vision narrowed to tunnels, dark around the edges. The last thing I remember clearly is Daniel shouting something, firing his shotgun at point-blank range as a tendril wrapped around his chest. The blast seemed to cause a momentary disruption in the entity. The humming faltered, the light pulsing from its sensory organs flickered. Daniel used that moment to push Samuel and me away, toward the creek. "Run," he shouted. "Get to water." Martin was already down. I didn't see what happened to him. One moment he was beside me, the next he was gone. Samuel grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the creek. We stumbled down the bank, splashing into the shallow water. The cold shocked me, back to full awareness. Behind us, Daniel fired again, the sound of his shotgun, now seemingly miles away, though he stood less than 30 feet from us. Then Daniel was gone. Not fallen, not taken, simply gone between one heartbeat and the next, as if he had been erased from existence. Where he had stood was only empty air and the entity's tendril retracting toward its main body. Samuel and I waded downstream, keeping to the water. The humming followed us, but it seemed less intense over the creek. We moved as fast as we could, slipping on submerged rocks, fighting against the current. The light continued to change, shifting through spectrums I have no names for, colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The entity kept pace with us along the bank, moving with a fluid grace that defied its size. Night fell with unnatural suddenness. One moment there was the strange bluish-white light, the next was darkness so complete that I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. Samuel's grip on my arm was the only thing that felt real. We kept moving, guided only by the sound of the water and the feel of the creek bed beneath our feet. The humming continued, sometimes fading, sometimes intensifying, until my skull felt like it would shatter from the pressure. I don't know how long we walked, hours maybe. My sense of time had become untethered. The water grew deeper, reaching our waists, then our chests. Samuel was half carrying me. By then, my strength nearly gone. We reached a section where the creek narrowed and deepened, the current strengthening. Samuel pulled me close. "Take a deep breath," he whispered, directly into my ear. "We're going under." The water closed over my head. The current caught us, pulling us through a narrow chute between rocks. I held my breath until my lungs burned, clinging to Samuel's arm. When we surfaced, the humming was gone. The night was still dark, but now it was normal darkness, stars visible overhead, the faint outline of the valley walls against the sky. We dragged ourselves onto the bank, shivering and exhausted. Samuel still had his rifle, the sling tangled around his shoulder. He checked it methodically, ejecting the soaked ammunition and wiping down the mechanism as best he could. I collapsed on the stony ground, too drained to move. "We need to keep going," Samuel said after a few minutes. "It's still out there, I can feel it searching." I nodded, though I wasn't sure he could see me in the darkness. With his help, I got back to my feet. We continued downstream, staying close to the water's edge but not in it now. The night was quiet but not silent. I could hear insects, the occasional call of a night bird, the normal sounds of a wilderness at night. Each of these ordinary sounds was a small comfort, evidence that we had returned to the normal world, evidence that we had returned to the normal world. False dawn was lighting the eastern sky when Samuel suddenly stiffened beside me. He raised his hand, signaling me to stop and stay silent. I heard it too, the humming, faint but growing stronger, not from behind us where the entity had been, but from ahead, further down the valley. "There's more than one," Samuel whispered, his voice cracking. The humming grew louder, coming from multiple directions now. The air began to change again, the pressure building. Samuel turned to me, his face barely visible in the growing light. "Aunt Nina," he said, "you have to get back to the reservation. Tell them what we saw. Tell them the old stories are true." Before I could respond, he pushed me toward a narrow side canyon that opened into the main valley. "Go that way," he said. "It leads to the eastern ridge. If you follow it, you'll reach the old hunting trail. That will take you back to the road." "I'm not leaving you," I said. Samuel's expression was calm, resolved. "One of us has to make it back. You're the medicine woman. They'll believe you." He pressed something into my hand, Thomas's sacred pipe, which he must have retrieved when I wasn't watching. "Take this as proof. Go now." The humming was very close. The light was changing again, the natural dawn light giving way to that unnatural bluish-white glow. I could see distortions in the air above the valley in 3 separate locations, the entities descending, unfolding into our reality. Samuel raised his rifle, a futile gesture, we both knew, but a human one. He smiled at me one last time. "I'll buy you some time. Go." I went. I still hear the first shots as I scrambled up the side canyon, Samuel's rifle firing in a steady, measured rhythm. The shots grew fainter as I climbed higher, finally stopping altogether. I didn't look back. I kept climbing, following the narrow canyon as it wound upward toward the ridge. The humming pursued me for a while, then gradually faded. By full daylight, I had reached the hunting trail Samuel had mentioned. I followed it eastward, moving as fast as my exhausted body would allow. I walked for 2 days. I had no food, no water except what I could find in small streams crossing the trail. My clothes were still damp from the creek, causing painful chafing and blisters. I slept in short bursts, hidden among rocks or dense underbrush, too afraid to stop for long. By the time I reached Route 49 on the morning of July 12th, I was delirious from dehydration and exhaustion. A family from Chicago on their way to Glacier National Park found me walking along the shoulder and called emergency services. No one believes what really happened. The official report states that we were separated during a sudden storm, that the others likely fell into ravines or were attacked by wildlife. They searched for 9 days and found nothing. No bodies, no equipment, no signs of what happened to Martin, Daniel, and Samuel. They found our truck where we had left it, with all our unused supplies still locked inside. They found no evidence of the entities, no trace of the circle where Thomas's pipe had been, no unusual readings or phenomena of any kind. I returned to Thomas's pipe to Joseph Create's fire, our eldest elder. He was not surprised by my story. He nodded as I spoke, occasionally closing his eyes as if in pain. When I finished, he held the pipe in his gnarled hands and was quiet for a long time. "The old ones called them Misist Napikwan, sky beings," he said finally. "They have been coming to this valley since before our people arrived. They do not hunt for food as we understand it. They harvest something else from us, something inside." He tapped his chest. "Our ancestors knew to stay away from the valley when the stars were bright and the air grew still. But knowledge is lost with each generation. Now people go where they should not." I asked him why the entities took some people and let others escape. He shook his head slowly. "They take what they need," he said. "Sometimes it is one, sometimes many. Those who escape are meant to carry the warning to others, but the warnings are forgotten and people return to the valleys. I have left my home in Bab. I've moved to Missoula, taken a teaching position at the university. I no longer practice traditional medicine. I no longer trust the knowledge passed down to me, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. We knew to avoid certain places at certain times, but we didn't understand the true nature of what waited there. I dream of the entity every night, its pearlescent surface, the 5 pulsing organs arranged in a pentagon, the impossible appendages that moved with such precision. I wake to the humming, a sound that seems to come from inside my own head. Sometimes I feel the cold pressure at the base of my skull, the numbness spreading down my spine. I've had MRIs, CAT scans, neurological workups. The doctors find nothing wrong physically, attribute my symptoms to PTSD and survivor's guilt. The entities are still there, still descending into remote valleys across the reservation, and probably far beyond. They are ancient, patient, operating according to patterns we cannot comprehend. They take what they need, and we cannot stop them. We can only avoid them, warn others, remember the old boundaries. If you find yourself in a wild place and the natural sounds suddenly cease, if the birds go quiet and the insects fall silent, if the air grows still and heavy around you, run. Don't look up. Don't try to fight. Find moving water if you can. They seem less able to perceive us there. But understand that running may not save you. Some are taken, some are spared, and there is no logic to the selection that we can understand. They have always been here. They will always be here. We are not at the top of the food chain. We never were.